All right, let's dive into a real head-scratcher today. We're going to try and solve a legal puzzle that could honestly affect anyone who's ever signed a lease. It's a story about promises, property changing hands, and some really surprising rules about who's left holding the bag when things go sideways. So let's get into it.
So, picture this. Years ago, you had a business. You assigned a lease to someone new and moved on with your life. Everything's fine. But then, out of the blue, you get a letter. Turns out the building has a new owner. The tenant you passed the lease to trashed the place and skipped town, and now this new landlord you've never even met is coming after you for the money? How is that even possible? Well, let's find out what the law has to say.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, we first have to meet the players. We need to understand who's who in this story and just how messy this situation got before our new landlord even stepped onto the scene.
So here's how it all went down. You've got Landlord 1, let's just call him L1, who originally leases a property to Tenant 1, or T1. After a while, T1 assigns that lease to a new tenant, T2. Sometime after that, L1 sells the whole building to a new landlord, L2. And here's the kicker, T2 causes a ridiculous amount of damage, goes completely broke, and then just vanishes. This leaves L2 with a huge, expensive mess on their hands. And we're not talking about a few scuff marks on the wall. We're talking about a massive $150,000 repair bill. Now with T2 gone and broke, L2 needs to find someone who can pay. And their legal search leads them all the way back to the original tenant, T1. So how is it even possible that the original tenant is still on the hook for this? Well, it all comes down to the power of the very first promise that was made in that original lease. It's a lot stickier than you might think.
This brings us to a really core legal idea called privity of contract. Don't let the fancy name fool you. All it really means is that when you first sign a contract, you create this direct, almost unbreakable legal bond with the other person. And here's the key part. Just because T1 passed the lease to someone else doesn't mean that original bond with the landlord just disappears.
Yeah, this really says it all. T1's promise to keep the property in good shape wasn't just for the few years they were there. It was a promise for the entire 10-year term of that lease. So in the eyes of the law, T1 basically guaranteed the landlord that the terms would be met for the full decade. So, can L2 sue T1 for the damage? Yes, absolutely. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, not all promises in a lease are created equal. The law splits them into two different categories. Some promises, like the duty to make repairs, are said to touch and concern the land. Think of them as being baked into the property itself. They travel with the property to any new owner. But other promises, like returning a security deposit, are considered personal. They're more like a private financial deal between the two people who made it.
Okay, so T1 is on the hook for the repairs, that part's clear. But T1 is thinking, hey, wait a minute, what about that huge security deposit I paid in the beginning? Can't we just use that to cover some of this? And that brings us to the next piece of our puzzle, the mystery of the missing deposit.
And this was no small deposit either. We're talking $100,000 that T1 paid to the original landlord, L1, way back when. So now that L2 is demanding money for repairs, T1, quite reasonably, wants to know what happened to their $100,000.
This is the question that you're probably asking right now, right? It just makes sense. The new landlord, L2, owns the building and is demanding money. So shouldn't L2 also have to honor the security deposit that came with that lease? And here is where the law throws us a massive curveball. The answer is no. Nope. It turns out, based on a major court case, the duty to pay back a security deposit is a personal covenant. Remember that? It's not attached to the land, it's attached to the person who originally took the money. So that obligation stays with L1.
This is honestly the best way to think about it. That $100,000 deposit was a personal debt. It was an IOU from Landlord 1 directly to Tenant 1. Landlord 2, the new guy, bought the building, sure, but he never co-signed that particular IOU. So legally, L2 has zero obligation to pay back T1's deposit. That's still L1's problem. So let's put all the pieces on the board now. We've got T1 owing L2 a bunch of money for repairs, and we've got L1 owing T1 a bunch of money for the deposit. This is where T1 tries to be clever and runs straight into a legal brick wall.
So T1 comes up with what seems like a perfectly logical plan. They say, okay, look, I owe the new landlord L2 150 grand, but my old landlord L1 owes me 100 grand. Let's just use the 100K to pay off most of the 150K, and I'll pay the new landlord the 50K difference. This is called a set-off, and it sounds totally fair, right? But it doesn't work.
The whole plan falls apart because of a really strict rule called the requirement of mutuality. It's actually pretty simple. For you to cancel out one debt with another, the debts have to be perfect mirror images of each other. They have to be between the exact same two people. You can't use someone else's IOU to pay your own bill.
Let's just look at the chart. It makes it so clear. You've got debt number 1, tenant 1 owes money to landlord 2. And then you have debt number 2, landlord 1 owes money to tenant 1. See, the lines of debt don't connect the same two dots. There's no mutuality. Since L2 doesn't owe T1 anything, T1 can't use the deposit L1 owes them as a credit.
So, after all that legal detective work, after all the twists and turns, let's look at the final ledger. Who actually has to write a check to whom when all the dust settles?
Here's the final breakdown. 1. L2 can and will successfully sue T1 for the full $150,000. 2. T1 has to pay it, and their clever set-off idea is a no-go. 3. T1's only option is to start a completely separate lawsuit against L1 to try and get their deposit back. And as if that's not messy enough, L2 probably has their own lawsuit against L1 for not transferring the deposit during the sale. It's just a whole mess of different legal battles.
And really, that's what this all boils down to, isn't it? The promises we make in contracts, especially in property law, can have incredibly long lives. Just because you assign a responsibility to someone else, it doesn't always mean your promise is erased. So the next time you sign or assign anything, it's worth asking, do you really know when this promise ends? Thanks for sticking with this one.